In 2001 in New York City, tragedy struck. Everybody knows the story that I'm talking about, that I'm gonna have to tiptoe around to avoid this video not being shown to as many people as possible, because this is a video that people need to see. Now, as you know, on that day in New York City, 2 buildings fell and thousands of people died. Over 3,000 people died. But what a lot of people don't know is that there was another building that day that most people never even saw collapse. That did. 47 stories tall, the building was never struck by a plane, and yet at 5:20 p.m. on that day, this building dropped in under 7 seconds, perfectly, symmetrically, into its own footprint. And we're going to refer to this building today as Building Number 7. The official explanation was that office flames started from the fiery debris that fell from the other 2, you could say twin buildings, caused a total structural failure in Building 7. But from the moment the dust settled, engineers, first responders, and skeptics have asked, is that even possible? And why was the collapse barely mentioned in any of the early reports? In this video, we're going to explore what may be the most overlooked piece of information and evidence from that tragic day in American history. And this story is dangerous. This story will open your mind, and this story and this information is incredibly important, so I do have to speak somewhat cryptically. Please try to follow along as best as you can. Because underneath the rubble of Building 7 to this very day lies a secret story, a piece of secret history cloaked in silence and death. As always, everybody, I don't plan on going anywhere or doing anything to myself. All parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. All the opinions presented on today's show are solely mine, Colin Browen, the host and producer of this program. And as always, if you yourself would like to check on the resources used to construct this episode, I'm talking about sometimes books, magazines, PDF files, web archives, websites, other videos, please check the resources document that's posted in the description of the show, because you might find it enlightening. There are always details that I myself missed. But let's get into this. So was the destruction of Building Number 7 the result of chaos or control? Was it the result of an accident or some sort of hidden controlled demolition? I want to start off by first saying that this episode is in no way downplaying the tragedy that happened on that horrible day in New York and the thousands of lives that were lost. It's an absolutely devastating piece of American history, and I know that an uncountable number of lives were affected by the horrific events carried out that morning by some of the most horrific people imaginable. This is not meant to demean the memory of any of those individuals. With a video like this, I am actively advocating for the whole truth to come out, because there is an astronomical amount of information surrounding that terrible day in New York that does not make sense, that is never added up. We are still getting information to this day, specifically with countries like Saudi Arabia having more involvement than they've ever copped to. I've read a number of very, very thorough books about this subject, including one great book that I'm hoping to adapt into something one day called Welcome to Terrorland. It's a great read. And this is one of those stories where once you go down the rabbit hole, you can't really get out, because the answers are there, but they're just so hidden. And there are so many layers of bullshit surrounding this thing. Official stories that fall apart, pieces of evidence that don't make sense, weird environmental factors that day, other weird things that were happening that day, incredibly weird things that were happening before, like stock trading and shorting. But we're going to save that for another longer video. With all that said though, I'm trying to handle this with the most respect possible. This is just a topic that I'm very passionate about. And yeah, I think it's time that we start talking about the most overlooked building from that fateful day. Building Number 7 was a 47-story steel-framed skyscraper located approximately 350 feet north of the 2 buildings that were attacked that day in Lower Manhattan, New York City. Building Number 7 was not attached to the other 2 main buildings, but was a part of the larger complex of buildings and was separated from the other 2 buildings by a small plaza and Versey Street, a 4-lane road. Building Number 7 was designed by Emery Roth and Sons, with a unique trapezoidal shape made with a steel frame construction with a reinforced core. Building number 7 was completed in 1987, making it a relatively modern high-rise at the time of that fateful day in New York City. In 2001, Building number 7 housed, at the time, numerous government agencies and financial institutions, including the United States Secret Service, the Central Intelligence Agency or CIA, the Department of Defense or DoD, the Internal Revenue Service or IRS, the Securities and Exchange Commission or SEC, Solomon Smith Barney, a global investment bank and securities firm, and also the building's largest tenant, and American Express Bank International. At 8:46 a.m. on that fateful day in New York, an American Airlines airplane carrying hundreds of passengers crashes into the northern building of the two larger buildings between floors 93 and 99. 17 minutes later at 9:03 a.m., a United Airlines commercial airplane, also carrying hundreds of passengers, crashed into the southern building of the two larger buildings, and immediately thousands of people began evacuating from both of the two buildings and surrounding areas, while sadly and tragically others remained trapped above the impact zones within the two main buildings. I think you guys know what I'm referring to here. 56 minutes after the northern building was hit, it collapsed to the ground. 29 minutes later, the more southern building followed, crumbling to the ground, and after the southern building collapsed, Building 7 caught on fire, reportedly having been ignited by debris from the northern building and its collapse. The fires in Building 7 continued to burn on 10 different floors, but the fire was mostly concentrated on floors 7 to 9 and 11 to 13. Approximately 7 hours later at 5:20 p.m. that same day, Building 7 collapsed to the ground, adding to the complete chaos around it. Thankfully, and interestingly, not a single person died as a result of that collapse, as the estimated 4,000 office workers had previously evacuated the premises. The National Construction Safety Team Act, enacted in 2002, granted the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST, the authority after the collapse and the attacks to conduct fact-finding technical investigations into building failures that resulted in significant loss of life or posed a serious risk of doing so. The collapse of the two main buildings was the first investigation carried out under this new mandate. As a part of that effort, NIST investigated also the collapse of Building number 7. Its three primary objectives, according to them, were to determine the cause and mechanics of the building's collapse, to evaluate the design, construction, operation, and maintenance practices used throughout the building's life, and also to identify specific areas in the building and fire codes, standards, or practices that may need revision to improve safety in future structures. First of all, let's talk about the published 130-page final report published by the NIST, which was available to the public in November of 2008, about 7 years later. Here are the key determinations from that report. They said that there was no plane impact or fuel from a jet involved in the collapse. They also said the collapse was caused by fire-induced failure, not by any explosives or organized demolition. They also claimed that the key trigger was the expansion of heated steel beams, which caused a critical beam on floor 13 to walk off its seat, leading to the failure of column 79, a vital interior column. This beam failure cascaded vertically, triggering the collapse of adjacent columns, and ultimately the global collapse. The collapse began internally, progressing east to west, then causing the visible, symmetrical descent of the building. Alternative hypotheses that were ruled out were the explosives or blast theory, because no sound consistent with large explosions were recorded or noticed, and there was no visual evidence of blast effects. And the diesel fuel theory, because fires from ruptured fuel tanks were not intense or sustained enough to cause a collapse. According to the NIST in their report, fire alone, in the absence of functioning sprinklers and due to thermal expansion and local connection failures, brought the building down. Building number 7 was the first known case of a tall, steel-frame building collapsing solely due to uncontrolled fire. It was the first of its kind. It was absolutely unheard of that such a thing like this actually could have happened and did happen. Design vulnerabilities, according to the report, that contributed to the collapse were long-span floor systems that amplified thermal expansion effects, structural connections that were not designed for thermal-induced movement. They said there was no redundancy in critical column supports, and they said that the fires were typical office content fires, which are not usually intense. The NIST made one new recommendation and reiterated 12 recommendations from the prior 2 main building collapse investigations. Key areas and recommendations from their report included improving designs against progressive or disproportionate collapse, explicitly accounting for thermal expansion and worst-case fire scenarios, strengthening fire resistance ratings and test methods, improving redundancy and performance of active fire protection systems like sprinklers and alarms, improving command control systems in high-rise fires, enhancing coordination and evacuation procedures, updating codes to consider multi-floor uncontrolled fires, mandating retention of design documents for buildings, and requiring multidisciplinary teams in complex high-rise design. Overall, and after 7 years of investigation, the NIST concluded that Building Number 7's collapse was not due to demolition or some sort of fuel-fed explosion, but rather a fire-induced progressive collapse initiated by failure at a single column, which was column 79, and the structural design, although code compliant at the time, lacked provisions for extreme fire scenarios without sprinklers. The report stressed the need for code reform, performance-based design, and better fire engineering practices. Overall, and after years of investigation, the NIST concluded that Building Number 7's collapse was not due to demolition or fuel-led explosion, but rather a fire-induced progressive collapse initiated by failure at a single column, which was column 79, and the structural design, although code compliant at the time, lacked provisions for extreme fire scenarios without sprinklers. The report stressed the need for code reform, performance-based design, and better fire engineering practices. The weird thing is, though, that office fires alone have never caused a full, high-rise steel frame building to collapse before that one fateful day in New York City, or a single time afterwards. According to the National Fire Protection Association Fire Analysis and Research Division, there are an average of 15,400 reported structure fires in high-rise buildings per year. Other high-rise buildings have been involved in similar or even more intense conditions than were found in Building Number 7 on that day, yet this is the only instance of a collapse like this in any recorded history, at least in America.
Now, it should be noted that there have been 2 other buildings that have fallen in a similar manner to Building Number 7, including the Plosco building, which fell in a somewhat similar manner in Iran in 2017 after an electrical short circuit caused the building to catch on fire. It then burned for 3.5 hours and underwent a progressive collapse starting from the upper floors. And there's also the case of the Edifício Wilton País del Almeida, which was a building that fell in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 2018. After something like a gas cylinder explosion caused a fire to start on the lower floors of the building before it burned for about 90 minutes, then collapsed progressively. However, those are the only 2 examples of any buildings falling under similar conditions, and they still don't meet the exact conditions under which Building Number 7 fell.
And when you speak in absolutes and you come to events that have only happened once and they're already shrouded in mystery, that's where the great, I feel, unraveling really begins. Over time, people grew suspicious of the demise of Building Number 7. After all, NIST refused to release key modeling data through different Freedom of Information Act requests, stating that releasing the full input data for the collapse simulations would for some reason endanger public safety. They argued that providing the full element analysis models and input files could expose vulnerabilities in high-rise buildings, particularly how they might fail under certain stressors like fire or impact, and that if such information were publicly accessible, it could be misused by people like terrorists or bad actors to plan additional attacks or engineer building collapses of their own. Critics of this analysis and finding, though, including people like engineers, architects, and researchers, argued that NIST's refusal undermined transparency and peer review, which are key pillars of scientific and engineering integrity. The collapse of a high-rise building due to fire was and still is completely unprecedented. So replicable, open models were essential, according to these people, to verify the group's findings and understand exactly how this could have happened. Skeptical of their closed-off investigations, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, or UAF, Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, conducted their own independent investigation into the collapse of Building Number 7 in 2015, after prompted by AE 911 TRUTH, which stands for Architects and Engineers for blah blah blah. I can't say that here. The AE 911 group is a nonprofit group of thousands of professionals in architecture and engineering who dispute the NIST conclusions and have advocated for years for a new, transparent, fully science-based investigation into the events of that tragic day in New York, particularly with focus on the collapse of Building Number 7. Their goal in studying Building Number 7 at the University of Alaska Fairbanks was to determine independently whether fire alone could have truly caused the collapse as claimed by the NIST. They wanted to use open source modeling and transparent methods so that the public and engineering community could replicate or scrutinize the results, to make these results public, to evaluate alternative collapse scenarios that might better match the observed collapse sequence, and to test the credibility of the progressive collapse mechanism proposed by the NIST using state-of-the-art engineering software and techniques. Keep in mind, this is almost 10 years after the report was released, give or take a few years, but technology had advanced so greatly just in that period of time. They wanted to use these newer modeling programs and this new information and data that had been gathered over the years and programs that had been developed and worked on to see if they would reach the same result. This group, the AE group that I just talked about, funded UAF's study and sought to provide an independent academic analysis of the structural mechanics of the collapse of Building Number 7, and this would indeed prove to be highly controversial. In March of 2020, after years of research, the University of Alaska Fairbanks released their final report, titled A Structural Reevaluation of the Collapse of Building Number 7. Their findings were incredibly interesting, to say the least. They concluded, after years of testing and analysis, that fire did not cause the high-rise to collapse, as claimed by the NIST, and they even went as far as to state that it would have been impossible for this to have occurred through fire-induced mechanisms alone, because the fires that occurred were not intense or burning long enough to compromise structural integrity. Additionally, the building contained only typical office combustible loads, estimated between 20 to 32 kilograms, which would only typically sustain fire in any given area for just 20 to 30 minutes, most definitely not at an extremely intense blaze for about 7 hours. They also determined that Building Number 7 collapsed due to a near simultaneous failure of all of the columns over a short time span. In other words, the entire building seemed to have given out all at once and collapsed to the ground, just as one would see if a building is strategically demolished in a controlled way. According to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the scenario proposed by the US government was just simply wrong. But let's get into some of the theories as to why the government could have possibly given a completely false narrative of what happened to Building Number 7 on that fateful day in New York. Regarding Building Number 7, several people in the past have openly made statements that completely contradict the government's narrative as to what happened. First, we have Richard Gage, the founder of the AE Group, who said, quote, "Building Number 7 fell symmetrically into its own footprint at free fall acceleration, something only a controlled demolition can achieve. Fires have never before caused the collapse of a steel-framed high-rise building," end quote. Then there's Barry Jennings, the New York City Emergency Management Deputy Director, who was interviewed before his death in 2008. He said, quote, "I heard explosions while still in Building Number 7 before either tower fell. Something happened in that building. It was like a bomb went off," end quote. Dr. Leroy Hulsey, who was involved in the University of Alaska Fairbanks study, said, quote, "Our study concludes that fire did not cause the collapse of Building Number 7. The building's failure was due to a global collapse mechanism not consistent with the fire-based explanation given by NIST," end quote. Kevin Ryan, the former executive at Underwriters Laboratories, stated, quote, "The steel used in the main two buildings was certified to withstand far more than the conditions reported by NIST. Their refusal to test for explosives is scientifically irresponsible," end quote. Now, do with those statements what you will, but I have to say, they're very interesting to say the least. Now, the reasoning behind the collapse and potential controlled demolition of this building that we're talking about today is kind of minor when you compare it against the actual main event of that day and the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of different theories and pieces of evidence and things that don't make sense and whistleblowers that have spoken out over the years, not even to mention the massive groups of victims' family members who still, to this day, are out there advocating for completely brand new investigations with completely unbiased looks, full transparency, new looks at evidence and analyzing of all the materials and data. But at the same time, it's deeply interesting and also very, very telling. The collapse of building number 7, like I've said before, occurred at 5:20 p.m. that day, hours after the main two buildings fell to the ground. Yet, it received very little attention, fueling suspicion amongst the public almost immediately. Obviously, the main focus that day was the attacks on the main two buildings and the attack on the other building in the Washington, D.C. area, which to some people allowed the story of building number 7's collapse to occur in relative media silence. A few news outlets reported the building's collapse before it even happened, allegedly reading from premature wire reports, and that's an interesting facet of the case, which has led to accusations of foreknowledge or warning or pre-planning. Did someone report to the media that this building had indeed collapsed because they knew that it was coming, but didn't realize that it hadn't happened yet? Maybe the day was so chaotic that a wire report was sent out saying that something had happened when it wasn't supposed to happen for another 5 to 10 minutes. Maybe something went wrong. But we need to get into specifics because being vague doesn't really cut it in these circumstances. You see, the BBC News, and this is documented, reported the collapse of building number 7 at around 5 o'clock p.m. that day, roughly 20 or so minutes before it actually collapsed in real life. In live footage from that day, BBC correspondent Jane Stanley is seen on camera reporting about building number 7's collapse while the building is still visibly standing right behind her. It's actually in the shot. No one really knew that it was going to collapse according to the official story, and at some point after the BBC correspondent Jane Stanley says this out loud, and maybe someone notices that the building is actually still visible directly behind her, shortly afterwards the satellite feed cuts out and they cut to another anchor.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing, and indeed it has. It seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. As you can see behind me, the appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because they don't really know where to turn. That's the very sad thing. I think there's going to be a lot of very, very traumatized people that has hit them very, very hard.
Jane, I think many of us, when we heard the news, perhaps on the radio earlier today, were completely flabbergasted by it and just couldn't comprehend it. I mean, it almost sounded too far-fetched. I was wondering what it's felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan.
CNN and other outlets also speculated or prematurely announced the building's collapse earlier that day. For example, in her reporting, Jane Stanley, that reporter with the BBC, reported that evening, quote, "The Solomon Brothers building, or building number 7, has also collapsed. This was a 47-story building, and like I just mentioned, you could still see the building in the background of the live shot." These premature statements from various media outlets are extremely odd. After backlash of potential foreknowledge, the BBC actually was forced to issue a statement that honestly only served to make the entire thing even more odd. Their statement read as follows, quote, "We no longer have the original tapes of our coverage, but it's clear from the footage that there was confusion and misinformation being passed around. We were simply reporting what we were told." So they no longer have the original tapes of their coverage from that tragic day in New York. This was the largest terrorist attack to have ever happened in world history. And you didn't keep any of the coverage? This coverage from all these news stations, from what I can tell, from ABC to local affiliates, has been enshrined because it is so important in world history. This is footage that replays every single year. It's used in new documentaries every single year. It's like literally some of the most important news footage ever recorded. And somehow they don't explain how or why it happened, but the BBC no longer has their tapes from that day. Well, that alone is very strange. But also, they claim in their actual statement to have simply been reporting what they were being told to report. Why were they being told by their sources that the building had collapsed when it hadn't? Could these messengers have been predicting the future, or did they already know from firsthand knowledge what was about to happen, and somebody made a crucial mistake and relayed this information just a few minutes early? Some people claim that the building itself was severely damaged and expected to collapse, and official sources were already suggesting it might come down. But I'll leave this up to you and your own opinions. Larry Silverstein is a curious figure in the mythos of that tragic day in New York City, and we're going to talk about him at length in another upcoming video here on this channel. There is a lot of weirdness surrounding Larry. Larry himself is an American real estate billionaire who was also the leaseholder of both of the main 2 towers in that complex at the time of that tragic day in New York City. Essentially, he was like pretty much the owner of the buildings. Just 6 weeks before that tragic day in New York City, in July of 2001, Larry Silverstein leased the entire complex, a 10 million foot property in Manhattan, for only a $13 million down payment. Imagine that. You have both of the main buildings, all of the other buildings in the most prime part of New York City, some of the tallest buildings on Earth, some of the most valuable buildings on Earth, for a $13 million down payment. I mean, that's practically chump change to people who have thick, endless pockets. But here's the weird thing. The property itself was built in the 1970s and had a huge asbestos problem. In fact, the asbestos problem within the 2 main buildings and the other surrounding buildings was due to cost the owners and operators of the complex over $1 billion. And you see, asbestos is extremely dangerous to people's health. There have been tons of buildings that have been abated for asbestos all across the planet. It was a very, very common substance to be included in the construction of buildings. Decades ago, it was cheap and people thought it was effective. Then it turned out that it was causing people, to have all these health conditions and cancers and horrible things happen to their bodies. And so back in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, there were all of these governmental rulings that came down, regulations, I don't know what you'd exactly phrase it as, but essentially stating you need to remove all of this asbestos from this property by this date, or we're going to charge you this insanely high amount of money. And when it comes to those main 2 buildings that everybody knows that crumbled that day, along with building number 7, the government in America had already ruled that all of that asbestos within those buildings had to be removed by the end of the year 2001, which had turned the properties, really all of the buildings there, into a really big financial burden for Larry Silverstein. I mean, he was going to have to spend over $1 billion to remove all of the asbestos, not only from those main 2 buildings, but from the other buildings in the complex as well. Which, when you really think about it, even if you are an extremely wealthy person, that's a lot of money to just have to pay out of pocket. You're not getting anything back for that money. You're just paying that money so that your buildings don't get shut down. And curiously, right before that fateful day in New York City, Larry Silverstein himself took out insurance policies on the main two buildings and the rest of the complex worth about $3.55 over $3.5 billion. And specifically, it was added into the verbiage of that insurance policy that he would get this money paid out to him if the buildings were somehow destroyed by a terrorist attack. That's in the actual wording of the insurance policy. Now, after building number 7 collapsed that day, Larry Silverstein and his legal team argued that each of the planes that day was considered as being a separate event. And they said that that meant that he should get double the claims, double the payout, over $7 billion. After a troublesome, bloody, long legal battle, Larry Silverstein eventually walked away from all this with $4.5 billion, which, if you actually crunch the numbers, is literally over a 34,000% return on his investment in less than 2 years. His payout alone for the destruction of building number 7 was $861 million, despite that one building being a very small portion of the entire complex. Think about that. Compared to all the other buildings there, it's relatively small, and yet it made up almost a fourth of the entire payout. Additionally, Larry Silverstein himself had extensive ties to something called the Carlyle Group, a private equity firm based in Washington, D.C., with investments in defense, aerospace, and oil, two areas that generally skyrocket in financial gain when a war begins. And to put this out in very basic layman's terms, it's a known fact that the Carlyle Group significantly benefited directly not only from the events of that tragic day in New York City when thousands of people died, but also from the war that followed. But here's the real weird coincidence though. Not only did the Carlyle Group, who had extensive ties to Larry Silverstein, who was basically at the time the bona fide owner lessee of the entire building complex, not only did the Carlyle Group have extensive business connections directly with the Bin Laden family, which we'll talk about in a second, but can you take a guess at who was a senior advisor to the Carlyle Group? I'll give you a couple seconds, think in your mind. Well, one of the senior advisors for that group with the direct connections to the man behind the two buildings in the entire complex, President George H.W. Bush, the father of the then sitting president of the United States of America, who is obviously a former president of America himself, and a guy that is deeply and was deeply enmeshed with the CIA, with intelligence agencies. I even have a poster, an original poster from San Francisco, that shows that George H.W. Bush was going to come to the Bohemian Grove to give a speech about the direction he was taking the CIA in when he was a CIA director. You cannot make it up. It's one of the craziest artifacts that I own from my collection. But also associated with the Carlyle Group was former CIA director Frank Carlucci, who was a board member. And another board member of the Carlyle Group was former Secretary of State James Baker. The group's ties to the Bin Laden family were through investment relationships, especially in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Bin Laden family, which were large and wealthy due to their construction empire in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Bin Laden Group had members who invested in Carlyle Group funds. Notably, Salem bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's half-brother, was an early investor in Carlyle before his death in 1988. Other bin Laden family members continued to hold stakes in Carlyle investment funds into the 1990s and early 2000s. The Carlyle Group was also known for its deep ties to the Middle East and for courting wealthy investors from the Gulf region, and the Bin Laden's family business empire made them an appealing partner. So now you've got the owner, the bona fide owner leaser of the two-building complex that would be destroyed by the end of the day, having deep business connections to a group that included the former president, who is the father of the sitting president, a CIA director, and also the Bin Laden family, the family of the guy who supposedly orchestrated the entire thing from his cave, wherever he was in the Middle East. So why do some people think the Bin Laden family also could have benefited from 9/11? So why do some people think that the bin Laden family, and not even the one that helped plan that tragic day in New York, could have benefited from the events of that tragic day? Well, the Carlyle Group owned and invested in defense contractors, invested in groups like United Defense, who made military equipment. After that tragic day in New York, defense spending absolutely surged, and companies like United Defense saw massive growth. If the bin Laden family themselves had held investments in Carlyle funds that held defense assets, they may have indirectly profited from the post-tragic day in New York military buildup before the eventual War on Terror. Because, as you probably know, that tragic day in New York also led to the War on Terror, which redirected trillions of dollars towards defense spending, intelligence spending, surveillance spending, and private contracting spending. The Carlyle Group, being a politically connected private equity firm deeply embedded in defense and infrastructure, stood to gain massively. Some people have connected the dots. The bin Laden family is linked to the Carlyle Group, which is linked to the military-industrial complex, or the close relationship between the military and the defense industry that supplies it. Also, as we said earlier, the Carlyle Group's advisory board included a former US president who was the father of the sitting US president, a former defense secretary, and also various CIA-linked individuals. This created a perception of an elite, powerful group of insiders who directly stood to profit from conflict and, yes, tragedy and death, something that has long been a core narrative of military-industrial complex critiques. The fact that George H.W. Bush had ties to the Carlyle Group and reportedly met with the bin Laden family members before that tragic day in New York City has also added fuel to this fire. Yeah, I didn't blow right past that. We're going to talk about that. George H.W. Bush, I don't know if you know this, but it's been documented, this is a fact, that he met with Osama bin Laden's half-brother on September 10th, and the day after September 10th, you know what that day is, at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Washington, D.C., at a Carlyle Group investor conference. Maybe it meant nothing, but obviously the timing on this is extremely unusual. Now you have the half-brother of the criminal mastermind behind the tragic day in New York meeting with the former president of the United States, the father of the current president of the United States, the day before and the day of the tragic day of New York, at an event put on by a group tied directly to the man who is the manager, owner, whatever, of the main target of the attacks from the tragic day in New York. Maybe it means nothing, but obviously this is all incredibly unusual timing. Another theory surrounding the bin Laden family is the black sheep theory, suggesting that Osama bin Laden, though disowned by his wealthy and powerful Saudi family, was not simply a rogue actor, but instead played some sort of a symbolic or instrumental role that benefited powerful interests, such as the military-industrial complex, Western and Middle Eastern intelligence agencies, political factions pushing for war in the Middle East, and financial elites connected to companies like the Carlyle Group. You can't help but think that there may be some truth to this. Despite being known to US intelligence for years, this is documented, including during the Soviet-Afghan War, Osama bin Laden allegedly orchestrated that tragic day in New York with surprising amounts of freedom. Some people claim that US intelligence agencies could have captured or killed him earlier, especially all the way back during the Clinton or early Bush years, but that they didn't. The question, though, is why? Well, aside from all these connections that Larry Silverstein has, he also made a pretty damning statement during his 2002 PBS documentary appearance. While being interviewed about Building Number 7, he said, "I remember getting a call from the fire department commander. I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it." End quote. That's a direct quote from Silverstein.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
And it left a lot of people questioning. Pull what? A lot of people obviously interpreted this as meaning pull it, which is demolition industry jargon for blowing up a building. But Larry Silverstein later clarified that he meant to withdraw firefighting efforts, pull them from the building. Either way, both clarifications would be harmful to the outcome of the building. It seems like at that point, he just wanted it gone. More insurance money, right? I mean, there was no one in the building, there would be no further loss of life if they pulled it, and it would mean an additional $861 million in insurance money. But this story, as you go down this rabbit hole, gets even stranger. As we said earlier, building number 7 held some very secretive and prestigious offices, including offices of the CIA, Secret Service, IRS, Department of Defense, SEC, Office of Emergency Management, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And these offices held within that building, they weren't just minor field offices, they weren't unimportant little offices that, oh, we represent this small portion of New York City, and we have some minor things that we do here that isn't important on the national scale. Some of these offices were actually investigative divisions that, at the time of Building 7's collapse, held extremely sensitive and important secret files and information on ongoing cases, particularly the SEC, or Securities and Exchange Commission offices, which reportedly lost 3,000 to 4,000 documents tied to high-profile Wall Street investigations of fraud that involved billions of dollars. Here are some of the major cases believed to have been impacted with the loss of building number 7. The Enron scandal, which was one of the largest corporate fraud cases in history. The SEC had been pursuing Enron's accounting practices, off-the-books entities, and executives for years. While Enron as a company collapsed in late 2001, the destruction of most, if not all, of the records relating to the SEC's investigation into the company may have served to further limit access that the government had to financial transaction trails, meaning that with the loss of the documents, they were essentially let off the hook, and millions, if not billions, disappeared. There was also the WorldCom fraud case, another massive telecommunications accounting fraud investigation that involved over $11 billion in misreported earnings. Many of the files, most of the important files from that case itself, were housed in the SEC's office in building number 7, and they disappeared. The SEC's New York office, which is in question here, had in its possession at the time of the collapse loads of documentation related to WorldCom's internal audits and their executive communications. Highly sensitive documents that could have been used to claw back billions of dollars from this company, and it all disappeared. Then there was the IPO laddering and analyst conflicts, which were both investigations into large investment banks like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and CS First Boston for fraudulent practices in the tech bubble, including IPO price manipulation and biased stock analysis for corporate gain. Many, if not most, of those documents also disappeared with the building, along with the investigation efforts. Then there was Citigroup and Solomon Smith Barney's investigations into Jack Grubman, a high-profile analyst allegedly manipulating stock ratings in exchange for investment banking favors. Those documents disappeared as well. The documents relating to the Arthur Andersen and corporate accounting investigation, which was also Enron's accounting firm, also disappeared. They were under scrutiny at the time of the building's collapse for their role in shredding audit documents and falsifying statements. They got let off the hook too, though. While some of this data was backed up, much, if not most of it, was completely lost. This is, back in the early days of technology and the internet and computers. And also a lot of these files and documents were original, which definitely helps feed the idea that someone or a group of people would have had their own personal motives to want to see that building destroyed, along with everything within it. Was the destruction and collapse of building number 7 an intentional cover-up of financial crimes and intelligence failures? Well, if building number 7 was demolished, explosives would have had to have been planted in, advance, suggesting some sort of long-term planning and possible inside access. How would this be possible? This would imply some sort of dark plan within our own government or within the private contracting world, especially given the secure nature of the building. Some argue that this supports the idea that that day in New York was a operation, which is a secretive action intended to mislead by making it seem as though this action was conducted by another party, usually an adversary or rival group. The term itself comes from naval warfare, where ships would sail under the flag of a different country to deceive their enemies, only revealing their true identity directly before launching an attack. Today, the term is most often used in relation to espionage, terrorism, or political maneuvering. But that narrative isn't really so far-fetched. Here's why. In 2000, the neoconservative research organization Project for the New American Century, or PNAC, stated in a policy paper, quote, "The process of transformation, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor," end quote. The idea is that tragic day in New York provided the justification for pre-planned foreign wars, like the war in Iraq, for instance, and obviously domestic policy changes like the Patriot Act. It's also suspicious because that tragic day in New York and the attacks that occurred within that day seemed to fulfill that exact pretext just 1 year later. Also, the USA Patriot Act, a sweeping piece of surveillance legislation, was signed into law just 45 days after the tragic day in New York. Critics have argued that it was way too comprehensive and long to have been written after the attacks, suggesting that this act itself and the documents that went with it were pre-prepared. I mean, you just have to look at the USA Patriot Act. It is extremely lengthy, it is very technical, it is very complex, and the implication is that tragic day in New York was used or created by individuals or powerful groups to justify reducing civil liberties, expand government control, and obviously boost spending in the defense and warfighting sectors. Another weird fact here. So everybody knows that after that tragic day in New York, we went to Iraq. Well, Iraq didn't even have a single connection to the tragic day in New York attacks or Al-Qaeda. Despite this, the Bush administration frequently publicly linked Iraq with terrorism and Al-Qaeda, creating the impression to the American public that Iraq was somehow deeply and intimately connected to that tragic day in New York. And this provided support and a public reasoning as to why we were heading there for war. The implication is that the day in New York was an emotional trigger to gain public support for wars that were already pre-planned and on the agenda. Why was war against Iraq on the agenda, you ask? Well, after the US-led coalition expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait in the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein remained in power. Many in the US government, especially neoconservatives, saw leaving Saddam in power as a massive mistake. There was a belief that a second massive war could finally remove Saddam permanently and complete all the actions and tasks that the first war didn't. Iraq also held the second largest proven oil reserves in the entire world at the time, and obviously controlling or influencing Iraq's oil output was seen as being incredibly, unprecedentedly strategically important, especially to prevent people like Saddam from using oil as a weapon or forming alliances with what they would say are countries that hate America that could disrupt the global markets. Iraq is obviously in the heart of the Middle East, bordering Iran, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. A US-friendly regime in Baghdad could serve as a launching point for projecting American influence across the region. I'm sure that's what they told themselves at the time. And a group of influential policymakers, many later part of the Bush administration, were associated with the Project for the New American Century, or PNAC, that group who said a year before the tragic day in New York that to usher in this new war and to usher in this change, we needed another Pearl Harbor level event. In the late 1990s, PNAC, that same group, publicly advocated for regime change in Iraq, stating that the US should seek to remove Saddam from power, even if UN efforts failed. They believed that spreading democracy by force in the Middle East would protect US security and remake the region in America's image. The US accused Iraq of retaining WMDs after the Gulf War. Although inspections had destroyed many of Iraq's WMD capabilities, intelligence agencies and politicians continued very publicly to assert, without any conclusive evidence, that Saddam had active programs and was developing and had possessions of WMDs or weapons of mass destruction. This argument was used heavily after that tragic day in September to get boots on the ground, but suspicions that people were lying about the existence of these weapons existed long before. After the Cold War, some strategists believed that the US should assert itself as the sole superpower in the world, unafraid to use military force to maintain global order. And Iraq was seen as a place where the US could send a message to enemies like Iran, North Korea, and even Russia or China. Under President Bill Clinton, Congress passed the Iraq Liberation Act, which made regime change in Iraq official US policy. It even allocated funding to Iraqi opposition groups and formally stated, quote, "It should be the policy of the United States to support efforts to remove the regime headed by Saddam Hussein," end quote. Some also believe George W. Bush had a personal motivation, whether to complete his father's war or to assert a stronger, more aggressive foreign policy legacy. Key advisors like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz had long-standing interests in Iraq and definitely saw that tragic day in New York as a perfect opportunity to get America on board with their cause and to finally spring the US military into action. But there were also so many other things lost in the destruction of Building Number 7. Obviously, when it comes to the CIA, we don't know exactly what all disappeared. There were reports that emerged after that tragic day in New York that described CIA agents actually sifting through the rubble of the building searching for any classified documents that still may exist within the piles of rock and ash. But with the CIA, obviously they don't like to talk about the files that they keep, so we don't have any idea exactly, to my knowledge, of what all was lost there. And it also should be noted that there were documents relating to civil and criminal cases that were lost in the destruction of the building as well. What cases those were exactly, I, to my knowledge, do not believe have ever been spoken about, but it's just, again, one of those things where, who knows? We can only sit here and hypothesize. However, the evidence that I've presented to you today through this episode and this video is all verifiable. You can find this data and this evidence in the resources document. These are all just things that I'm pointing out, saying, doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I'm allowing you guys to make whatever you'd like to out of this evidence that I'm simply laying in front of you. In conclusion, the official explanation from the NIST, to go back almost 2 decades into the past, tells us that fire and structural failure alone brought down Building Number 7. Yet many independent researchers, architects, and engineers continue to raise serious doubts about that conclusion, pointing to the building's near freefall collapse, the uniformity of its fall, and the lack of precedent for any other steel-framed high-rise building falling this way due to these conditions. Add to this the lack of media coverage, the federal agency residents who lost thousands of investigative documents related to massive financial fraud, CIA documents that are still hidden in secrecy that are now destroyed forever, and also the deep political and financial connections that the building and the management and owner of the building held, especially when it comes to the Carlyle Group. And what you're left with is a case that's really less about and more about the need for clarity, transparency, and truth. Was the collapse of Building Number 7 just some sort of bizarre, tragic anomaly? Was it a controlled demolition? Or was it something even deeper, like a operation or a cover-up? The evidence obviously is still debated, but one thing is very clear. Until all questions are addressed with full transparency, the mystery, the shroud of darkness that hovers over the story of Building Number 7 will continue to cast a long shadow over the story, the full story, of that tragic day in New York City. Obviously, I have an entire script. It's about 70, 80 pages long, delving into all of the events of that day that I'm still waiting to release a little bit because there's more information that I'm adding and more that I'm learning and more books that I'm reading. It's obviously probably the most complex theory of all time, besides maybe JFK, and the theory that a large portion of Americans believe in. It's one of the most popular of all time. But I'm going to leave you on this solemn note. God bless every single one of you out there today. If you happen to watch this video and you had a family member affected on that day, you lost somebody, you lost a friend, you know somebody who was affected, my heart and my soul goes out to you. And it's really horrific stuff. Every time that the tragic day in New York rolls around on the calendar every single year, I spend hours rewatching footage, watching documentaries, reading, just still in absolute shock and horror at what happened. And I, just like so many millions of other people, want to know the full truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So only by making videos and podcasts and writing stories and raising the alarm on things that don't make sense, that have never been truly explained, do I feel like there will ever be enough pressure to get someone to finally crack. I mean, there have been a lot of developments actually this year, especially with the Saudi connection, which can be explored in a whole nother video if you guys would like to see that. But yeah, God bless all of you. Thank you for watching today. Please be sure to comment on the video, let me know your thoughts, like the video, subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. I love and appreciate every single one of you out there. Have a very blessed rest of your day. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see y'all next week.